Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from FKA Twigs, titled LP1. But first, let's talk about sex. Now, more specifically, we're going to be talking about sex with regards to music, you perverts. Now, it's long been held that sex sells in some capacity, and you can point to dozens, if not hundreds, or even thousands of artists who have used sexuality in some way in order to sell their records. Now, very tellingly, the number gets a lot smaller when said sexuality is placed within the music and not just the image selling the music. And it gets even smaller still when you have to discount the many acts who have simply made music about sex in order to titillate and nothing else. Looking at you, pussycat dolls. And if you want to shrink that number even further, discount all the artists who use their music to talk around sex, using metaphors and symbolism to describe sex to get around the censors, or to make their songs have some vestige of additional class or poetry, or at least try to. No, today we're going to be talking about a very small group of artists, those who use music that is written plainly about sex, and can even sound like sex on the surface, but in reality sex is the metaphor itself being used for other emotions and other subjects beneath that material. Now, this is a much trickier balance to pull off because sex is one of the most intimate, powerful, passionate experiences one can have in their lives, and it can come across as hyperbolic if played poorly. And using it to represent many other things in art can be very tricky indeed, mostly because the majority of audiences will simply focus on the sexual imagery on the surface and take things all too literally. You want a prime example of that dichotomy playing out in modern music? Do What You Want by Lady Gaga featuring R. Kelly. Easily one of the best songs off of art pop, if not the best song altogether, and yet it suffers the frustrating lack of lyrical cohesion, where Lady Gaga is using sex as a metaphor to describe her tempestuous relationship with her audience and the press and how they judge her work, and then R. Kelly gets on the song and makes it all too literally about sex. And you know what the real startling thing is? That R. Kelly is such a force of personality on that song. He's that good that he can make even critics like myself think that the song is really all about sex all along. So okay, how do you get around problems like these? Enter FKA Twigs, with the FKA standing for formerly known as, in order to get around a naming controversy that she had with another artist. Now, she started building some really serious buzz in the independent scene last year with her second EP through the Young Turks indie record label in England, and a series of music videos that did not shy away from some really thought-provoking and almost controversial imagery, and with just a simply stunning voice, some fairly potent lyrics and instrumentation that blended spacious PBR&B and indie electronica that recalled acts like, say, James Blake. It was the sort of music that, well, sounded like sex, and yet seemed to be saying a whole lot more beneath it. So of course I picked up her debut album LP1, especially after the tidal wave of critical acclaim started pouring in, and, well, surprise surprise, the album actually deserves a lot of it. Make no mistake, LP1 by FKA Twigs is very good, possibly even a great record that introduces a potent indie pop R&B act that shows tremendous promise in making her brand of music sound, well, sexy as hell, and yet having some real substance behind it. And while the album is definitely not perfect, there are enough niggling issues that do hold it back, at least for me. FKA Twigs managed to do what many of her contemporaries in this particular subgenre didn't or could not do this year. She actually made me care what she had to say, and that's saying something. So okay, let's start with the biggest highlight of this record that will grip you right out of the gate. FKA Twigs herself. Holy shit, I have not heard an R&B singer with this much control, poise, and sheer talent on a record in quite some time. And while for once the production doesn't feel the need to drown her in reverb or oversell her presence most of the time. Now the mix is very expansive, and FKA Twigs makes use of all of it to create a very intimate, very potent atmosphere. I think what really impressed me most about her voice was her versatility as a performer. Now, you would expect with her breathless, Mariah Carey and Aaliyah inspired coos, she'd play more to the fragile, vulnerable songstress persona, but there's a real quiet strength, sexual maturity, and presence to her material that just impresses me so much more than, say, Beyonce's straightforward dominance. And whenever the mix and the production stays out of the way, FKA Twigs delivers some jaw-droppingly good vocal performances, flitting from intimate R&B to gentle, hymn-like gospel swell, like on the opening track, track preface, the reverb-heavy closer, or where she sings over a fragment of an old Air Supply melody on 2 Weeks. Now, it definitely helps matters that FKA Twigs is actually a pretty damn solid songwriter, and which takes us to lyrics and themes. Now, while you can definitely tell she doesn't quite have a firm grasp on some technical lyricism yet, there are a few too many clumsy lines that, even when they're sung reasonably well, the ideas behind the majority of these tunes actually do a fair bit to make them stand out regardless. And as I mentioned earlier, many of them feature sex and incapacity as an extended metaphor for deeper subjects, what's going on beneath them, and the emotional drama there. So while Lights Out recalls one of Kanye West's most legendary lines from My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy on one of the best songs from that record, here FKA Twigs uses it as a challenge to men to handle their egos and to be willing to display that sort of affection and consequent vulnerability in public towards her. That challenge to men to be worthy of mind-blowing sex, which, to be fair, FKA Twigs makes work because, well, her music backs up her assertions rather credibly. It comes across again in 2 Weeks, which is more straightforward dominance by inverting sexual imagery of penetration, which actually works quite well. And the determination to fix a broken relationship through sexual satisfaction on Give Up. There's more emotional stakes here that's sold quite well. Hell, that dominant attitude continues onto the final track, Kicks, a song that shows that she's just as capable of satisfying herself when he's not around, just like he does. And yet she doesn't hesitate to invert that emotional dynamic, showing real internal drama and vulnerability on the troubled song Pendulum, the angry and yet very desperate pleas of Numbers, and the gentle pleas of Closer for her to be more emotionally intimate. Now, this might seem to present something of a contradiction, but it's the songs that aren't explicitly about sex that do the most to highlight FKA Twigs outside of her relationships. The best song being Video Girl, a song commenting on her time working as a backup dancer and eventually becoming extremely successful, and now wanting to break away from that image for her art. And yet, it's a part of herself that she can't escape even as she tries, even trying to believe the lie that she has told herself and to other people. It speaks to themes of seeking control, and yet, like the pendulum shifting back and forth in her relationships, it's not always something that she can attain. And in the very end, the only thing that she has solid control of on this album is her own pleasure. And honestly, to a certain extent, that might just be enough, at least for her. So you know what? If I have this much positive things to say about her lyrics and themes, which I really liked on this album, where does this record start slipping for me? Honestly, it comes in the instrumentation, which I describe as somewhere between the glitchy yet expansive sound of that last 100 Waters record, The Moon Rang Like a Bell, and the soulful, more understated sounds of Rye. And, you know, I can't help but feel that this record would have been a hell of a lot better if they stuck more towards the latter than the former. Many of the songs on this record have simply just been better if they had just stuck with the vocals, the scratchy, jagged percussion, and the beats, and occasionally maybe a synth melody or two. But too often the songs feel overloaded with production elements that do not complement the overall song. The flat guitar tone that just crops up throughout Lights On, that ear-piercing synth that opens up on Video Girl, that's just absolutely intolerable. I really didn't like it. And that clunky, tingling bells that punctuate Numbers probably make it the worst track on the album. They feel like elements that could have worked in the right mix, but here they really do not complement FKA Twigs' voice, especially with her smoother tone. Even if that tone is chopped up and sampled and pitch shifted as much as they can. And really, that's the other problem. When you have a singer as good as FKA Twigs, and it makes this expansive and electronic, you're eventually going to run into awkward vocal effects and pitch shifting, and it rarely, if ever, sounds good. If anything, it sounds tacky. The best possible example of it maybe working is the heavy reverb on Closer, but that song features the ever so delightful chipmunk voice effect that's just audio poison on the song for me. It crops up again on Kicks too, talking about two songs that I otherwise really love, with for some impressive and memorable synth lines and melodies, and then the chipmunk voice effect crops up, and god damn it, that just sucks. And you know what? Here's the thing. There are some great instrumental moments on this record that I really did like. I really like the dark swell of 2 Weeks. One of the few examples of that brand of pitch shifting actually managing to work. I love the rich harmonies and the clattering percussion on Pendulum, and I really like the ghostly keys and almost trap-inspired R&B vibe of Give Up. But it frequently feels like the production is getting in the way of the song's natural sound, especially with her voice. They work fine on their own. They don't need that additional glitch element, especially when it sounds forced and tacked on, which it occasionally does here. But you know what? But in the end, these complaints are pretty minor, all things considered, because the more I've listened to LP1 by FKA Twigs, the more it has stuck with me as a damn strong record. Let me put it like this. When I'm trying as hard as I possibly can to ignore the annoying effects and just focus on the moments that are just gorgeous and really thought-provoking, you got something special on display here. And yet, I really can't ignore all of those glitchy, annoying effects, or the songwriting that could just use a little bit more lyrical detail or really weighty moments to anchor this record, which means for me, I'm ultimately going to give this album a strong 7 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation. Folks, we've seen all manner of R&B and soul-inspired acts rise to the forefront this year, especially in the mainstream, but FKA Twigs, she's one of the best. Make sure to check her out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Do you happen to know that I actually write things outside of video reviews? Yeah, actually, you can check out one of my short stories that's recently been featured in a new published anthology available in ebook form titled Love, Loss, and Longing, a romance anthology. Link is in the description below. Seriously, check this story out. My story is called Making Dreams Untrue and featured with a bunch of other stories from a bunch of really talented authors. So yeah, otherwise, if there's anything else you want me to cover in these reviews, any albums that came out this year, earlier, or coming out later this year, or if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm more than happy to hear about it. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.